This event has been a very long time in the making, and we couldn't have brought it to fruition without the dedication and expertise of Dr. Carol Shiner Wilson. A longtime supporter of the museum and an esteemed scholar, Carol has devoted herself to many years of research, all in the pursuit to ensure that Millie's stories and the stories of the women she touched in her career are preserved and celebrated. We're deeply grateful for her work and honored to have her with us here today. Now, before I welcome her onto stage, let me tell you a bit more about our esteemed speaker, Dr. Carol Shiner Wilson. Carol is a recognized authority on the life and art of the remarkable Millie Johnstone. Carol has taught English, French, and women's study and served 16 years as the Dean of the College for Academic Life at Muhlenberg College. Academic honors include Phi Beta Kappa and awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities and American Philosophical Society. She has published with Oxford University Press and the University of Pennsylvania Press. Many of her articles and presentations are close examinations of women's needlework in literature within historical and cultural contexts from 1650 through the 20th century. Her most recent presentation on Johnstone was called No Minks, No Diamonds, No Bridge for Me, and it was presented at the National Museum of Industrial History. An avid reader, Carol serves as an evaluator of fiction and narrative nonfiction for the National Chautauqua Book Prize. A transformative moment in her Johnstone research was when photographer Joseph Elliott, who is also with us today, he graciously took her on a personal tour to witness the steel making in a blast furnace the night before the very last Bethlehem steel cast in 1995. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Shiner Wilson to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Got to get this figured out. Is that good? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Abby. That's a wonderful introduction. I probably just hit something that made sound do something bad. But anyway, and I certainly want to thank the folks at the Allentown Art Museum. You are extraordinary. Abby and Claire McCree, who many of you heard do a mini tour of the Johnstone exhibit. Certainly Elaine Mihalikas, Margie Makowski, Chris Potash, and Max Weintraub. I'd also like to thank the director of the National Museum of Industrial History, Andrea Zaya, and Society of the Arts serving the Art Museum, especially Pretty Merchant and Peggy Herman. And yes, thanks to photographer Joe Elliott for that transformative experience. I certainly want to thank Millie's loved ones. Mira, who is here today. Lo Holton, daughter-in-law, is not here. And Poochie, the niece, Margaret Thomas, will be here via video. So thank you so much, all of you, for your incredible support. Fearless enthusiasms. Joe Cantini, artistic collaborator and her longtime friend, sought to capture Millie's spirit with this intriguing juxtaposition of terms. Now, how does that play out in her art and life? And note that I use the term Millie rather than the more formal Johnstone in that kind of intimate spirit of fun that we all appreciate. She was fiercely independent, openly resistant to the confining expectations as the wife of a Bethlehem Steel executive, and according to one person I interviewed, quote, Bethlehem Steel wives were a stable full of thoroughbred fillies. Millie Johnstone was a zebra, and she didn't care. I said, Jim, right. Yet outside steal officialdom. She mesmerized people, ordinary and celebrity, by her quiet grace, her spontaneity, her youthful joy, capacity for deep friendships, and underlying intuitive intellect. Intuitive intellect. She had a knack for connecting with artists and intellectuals. I'm going to drop a couple of names. There are lots more, but just a couple. Philip Johnstone, the architect, painters Picasso, Georgia O'Keeffe, authors Anais Nin, Truman Capote, and the fascinating intellectual Elias A. Lowe, who was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Her letters are dazzling, and like Millie, are original, intimate, immediate, philosophical, playful, rich with insights about books, art, human behavior. They in themselves deserve to be published. So if there's a publisher here, let's talk afterwards. Her core identity was as an artist. Early on, a performing artist who studied dance with Ruth St. Denis and Martha Graham. She was herself a groundbreaking visual artist in the late 1940s and 50s who used needlepoint, trivialized as decorative craft, to anticipate the robust fiber art movement in the 1960s and 70s. So today, weaving, art quilts, and more are in museums alongside paintings and sculptures. Just go upstairs and see. She believed in the transcendent power of art, quote, to touch the heart, to stir insight, to transform, and to heal. Two important historical contexts. Now, since the 1830s, there had been an incredible concern about the dehumanizing consequences of industrialization and a faster pace to life. I think we still feel that now. And then there's AI. So there were fearsome new technologies, frankly, like the atom bomb. And as an artist, Millie sought early on to engage with, not run away from, but to engage with and reshape the world of industry and technology to create a hospitable humanscape. Theorist Kepis was actually to articulate that same philosophy later on in 1956. And then she did come across his writings, and she went, oh, yes, that resonates with me. There was also the lived reality of post-World War II. So much death, including the Holocaust in Hiroshima. Her son George almost died in Europe. And then there was, of course, the Cold War. Palpable fear of nuclear annihilation by the Soviet Union. She was a spiritual seeker, incorporating Zen Buddhism, the Japanese tea ceremony, Quakerism, and traditional Judeo-Christianity seamlessly into her life and art, including a decades-long search to come to terms with the tragic death of her young son after he was mauled to death by an escaped wolf in her first husband's private zoo. Just a brief biography. She was born in Philadelphia in 1900, a Quaker mother, a Catholic father. She was baptized Episcopalian. She received a Quaker education. She also went to finishing school. And in 1920, she married Oliver Williams Holton, the colorful son of a Catasauqua industrialist. He was a Cornell grad in animal husbandry who established a private zoo in New Jersey. They had two sons, George and Tommy. In the 1920s and 30s, she studied dance with Ruth St. Denis and later Martha Graham, creators of modern dance. St. Denis was a powerful, powerful role model, bold, innovative, determined, who taught a disciplined awareness of the female body and introduced Millie to Eastern spirituality. The clothing, Buddhist thought, and music of the Hindu dance allowed Millie to become absorbed into another world. Always fascinated by flowing fabric and color, she later deployed clothing as a force of resistance to the business culture at Bethlehem Steel. In 1927, little Tommy, age 2.5, died of wounds inflicted by that escaped wolf. For the rest of her life, Millie worked through the trauma of that event, seeking to make peace with that literal wolf and metaphorical wolves in her life. In 1935, Millie married Bill Johnstone, rising star in Bethlehem Steel, and they built Still House, their home on 11 acres on Saucon Valley Road. Her son George became a brilliant photographer for the UN and National Geographic. And there was also this creekside cabin near their home. It was a quiet retreat for needleworking alongside friends and family. In the 1940s, she studied painting and art history with George Rickey and later Joe Cantini at an innovative Carnegie-funded program at Muhlenberg College. She also took 2 courses at the Barnes Foundation. Joe and Margaret were both accomplished artists who had studied with Bauhaus artist Joseph Albers at the Black Mountain School. Millie cherished Joe, Margaret, and their 2 sons, David and Pico. Margaret was Quaker, and Millie introduced 12-year-old David to Zen Buddhism. In 1944, she met woodworker George Nakashima, wife Marion, and their little girl Mira in a New Hope bookstore. You'll hear more shortly. All had just been released from incarceration in an internment camp in Idaho. Millie found in George a like-minded, ecumenical, spiritual seeker. Baptized Catholic, Nakashima had lived on an ashram in India and practiced Zen Buddhism. Taken by his exquisitely crafted, spiritually infused furniture, Millie was an early, enthusiastic client. In 1948, she toured a steel plant, and steel making became her muse. Fearless enthusiasms took hold when she challenged art traditions and the corporate culture of Bethlehem Steel. Art traditions. She turned upside down tropes of industry and steelmaking in early paintings like John Ferguson Weir's The Gun Factory from 1866 and photographs from the late 1920s by Margaret Bourke White, where the focus was really on the hypnotic, powerful, blazing fire of production. Another trope, less common, was to focus on steel workers' muscular bodies, as in Thomas Hart Benton's 1931 mural, America Today. Now, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation mentality. She was fully aware of her own privilege. Fully aware of that, the opportunities she had. She was also alienated by the arrogance, provincialism, and cold rationality of male privilege and power that ignored social issues and that was an anathema, couldn't recognize modern aesthetics, that worshipped golf and luxury. Oh, you know that. You probably know about the Angus cattle that they raised on the grounds to feed the Bethlehem executives nice steaks. Okay, all that. Millie found wives' lives conventional and confining. She detested empty rituals of cocktail parties and being trapped in a sea of black dresses, which she defiantly confronted by wearing her favorite and flowing coat, chartreuse dress with a vibrant Siamese blue scarf. Her enthusiasms threatened the order. Now think about that. It really threatened the conventional order. And that included that she swam in the nude, their own pool, not the club pool, and that she volunteered for Planned Parenthood. Now, some people say, oh, but she was rich. Of course, everything was okay. Of course she could resist. But actually, resistance is a lot harder from inside whatever that pod is. You're living with it all the time. You're being judged all the time. So she, I think, resisted courageously. And of course, there could be punishment. Your husband's career. What happened? That's another interesting story. Bill. What about Bill? She saw him as a creative outsider for her to protect. She was his confidant, and as she stitched, he discussed his frustrations with management's resistance to change, and he rehearsed his arguments for innovative policies. Bill was a visionary who early on advocated modernizing plants and developing strategies for emerging global markets. Joe Cantini said that he brought the steel, and I love this. He brought it out of, quote, out of the spittoon era, end quote. Historians have written about that a little differently, but still advocating Bill. He was a civic leader who loved the arts and sang, and then he was on the Board of Governors of the Bach Choir. Now think about this title, Little Man. What now? See Bill there? He's a diminutive, isolated figure alone with, quote, the risks of decision-making, end quote. There are two immense powers there. The power of nature's blazing sunset asserting itself before the looming iconic blast furnace with its own kind of fire. Oh, what a contrast with this early Millie self-portrait. This needlepoint was awarded the first prize in the miscellaneous category by the American Craftsman Educational Council and toured major museums nationwide in 1953. Our eyes is taken up the spiral staircase to the moon of imagination. Freedom, exploration, curiosity, all within the little girl, but inspired by steel making. She's diminutive, but energetic. Millie was transformed, writing this reaction to the kaleidoscope of colors, shapes, sounds, and high temperatures in 1948. I was drawn into the percussive beat of steelmaking's tensions and power, the primordial surge of production, dust catchers, skip cars, sawtooth roofs, or a blast furnace against a red sky, the visual excitement of turning hot metal into cold steel, suggesting infinite possibilities for working in thread, fluorescent red for the burning crackle of scrap iron, or yellow angora for poured steel, end quote. She was caught in the, quote, magic mood, men in masks pushing levers, switches, and buttons. Colors and composition of needlepoints were dictated by the industry, its dissonance, texture, and drama, by the symbolic forms of machinery in relation to men, poetry in a steel mill. You know, she felt both the energy, but she was also very reverent in this magnitude. Now, note that she quickly transcends the actual through her artistic imagination and the interplay of texture, form, and color. A passionate learner, she then did impeccable research, including many on-site visits where she talked with workers and supervisors. It was done with respect and with general interest in what they were doing. She really saw them as teachers, and it wasn't just the boss's daughter and catering to her. Then she assembled and reassembled pieces for collages, then collaborating initially with Chilean painter Pablo Bouchard, and then for 30 years with Joe Cantini, they created together a design or cartoon, as they were called, for the canvas. This design was not final, for she revised and adjusted constantly. Not quite the right color. We need to shape this a little bit differently. And her famous quote is, "I rip as much as I sew." Eclectic imagination, primarily modernist, abstract, not figurative or representational, fascination with an experimentation with geometric shapes and with color, always fascinated with color, and complemented her instincts with inquiry into color theory of artists including Matisse, Paul Klee, and Joseph Albers. Juxtaposition of colors and shapes. And you see this in the Mrs. Ingot needlepoint upstairs. See, and for her, ultimately, color was related to feeling. It was vital for feeling, which Millie privileged over and against rationality. Millie also held that feeling was essential in any art, including literature. She praised Dostoevsky, Baudelaire, Dylan Thomas, and others as, quote, drawing you into the blood and nerves of things. They make you feel what they feel. Yet it doesn't have to be violent. It can also be tender and lyrical, end quote. Other dimensions of her work, surrealism, cubism, South American indigenous art, the Bayeux tapestry, the unicorn tapestries, images from Eastern religions, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. Her studio was her lap. And she had multiple projects going on at the same time, and she stitched everywhere. The cabin, but also on Bill's numerous business trips. Iron ore fields in Michigan and Chile. Public gardens in Paris. A camel market in Marrakesh. And inevitably, people drew in to look and to talk with her. Initial public responses to her needlework exhibitions reinforced domesticity, claiming that Johnstone's works were, quote, in a long continuum of women's work celebrating a husband's accomplishments. Most notable, Queen Matilda stitching the conquests of William the Conqueror in, 1066. Publicly, Millie insisted that her art complemented her husband's creativity in the business world. Privately, she fumed at the sexist assumptions. She let loose her hostility toward the steel. And she insisted, it's a great quotation, that a woman's artistic needle and a surgeon's needle could heal. In an era when women purchased pre-printed patterns, she urged them to look around them with fresh eyes, find subjects in their everyday lives to design and stitch. So for her, steel making was present, but also there was a drawing by 8-year-old Mira after a horse show. So these were, quote, near at hand, end quote. She found that phrase in a 1640 poem called In Praise of a Needle and incorporated it into a 1955 piece that fused traditional sampler style and modernism. Even in 1948, the needle was linked to the 19th century middle-class ideology of domesticity. Stability at home and of the nation, it was asserted, was dependent upon a woman being anchored in her home, sewing, knitting, or otherwise using the moral compass of her needle for her family. In the Renaissance, art was not really differentiated from craft or art from artisan. Those Italian terms are the same. Yet by the 18th century, a female-signified needlework was considered craft, decorative, utilitarian, and considered easier to do, and it's just for the home. As opposed to art, painting, or sculpture, inspired by imagination in the domain of men. By the 1960s, with the continuation of found objects as components of art, and certainly the rise of feminist discourse in art and society, weaving needlepoint quilts eventually found their ways into art museums. And art has been more broadly understood. Successors, you're probably familiar with Judy Chicago and her monumental dinner party or birth project of the 1970s, and Faith Ringgold's African American narrative quilts of the 1980s. Millie was in a close circle of artistic friends who were early in the fiber art dialogue, three of whom I will note. She was friends with innovative art weaver Lenore Tawney, who produced large, open weave sculptures in her New York studio in the 1950s, not her lap. Another friend was Toshiko Takaizu, fiber artist and ceramicist, who established a studio in New Jersey in 1965. Best friends Tawney and Takaizu, as well as Millie, drew some of their inspiration from visits to indigenous weavers in Guatemala. And Millie's son had a house there. Even though he was around the world on photographic gigs all the time, he did have a place in Guatemala, and her grandson Thomas was born there to George and wife Lo Holton. Note this gorgeous cape. I think a lot of you were oohing and ahhing over it in the mini presentation before this one. Designed and worked for Millie by Alice Kagawa Parrott. She loved the freedom of capes, and this cape with its palette of bright pink and contrasting purple is so Millie. Parrott and Takaizu, both Hawaiian-born of Japanese heritage, were friends at the University of Honolulu and the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. Parrott settled in Santa Fe, a site popular with Millie, the Nakashimas, and others. And lots of interesting stories connected with that. Parrott was celebrated for integrating insights and techniques, including using natural dyes from Native Americans. Now this needlepoint has recognizable aspects of steel making: blast furnaces, ingots, a torpedo or submarine car, ships, even the iconic I-beam tucked down there toward the bottom. But we shouldn't, and I hope I haven't led you to reduce the images to the pictorial. What a title, Industrial Dollhouse. Note the juxtaposition of male signifying industrial with the little girl signifying term dollhouse. The little girl is the artist. She's in charge. These figures, the working figures, may be diminutive, but they are energetic and innocent, like children at play. Notice, no stuffy executives are in this portrait of steelmaking. This is, yeah, I think we... So sorry, Carol. Got it? Should I try to just shout? No, don't. Okay.
Connected again. There we go.
All right.
Thanks, Carol. There we go.
Technology humanized? Okay. So the title, we mentioned that. No stuffy executives here. Now this is industry humanized by the artist Sneedle. So the theorist Keppish is alive here, even though this was done 6 years before he published his Landscape in Art. Millie's also is a subversive stitch. It celebrates the energy of steelmaking. It domesticates. It does not emasculate. And again, it's kind of as if she and the workers it's theirs. It doesn't belong to the executives. Now, this needlepoint portrays women at the steel. It's kind of hard to get your eye away from that gorgeous bride. But take a look on the left. You will see an energetic worker dancing atop a plane. So this suggests that we're looking at wartime production at Bethlehem Steel. Now, this iconic Rosie the Riveter was one of 2,200 female workers at the local Beth Steel plant. And they weren't just welders. When we think Rosie, we think welders and all that. But there were also armed security guards who were, in fact, proud of being called pistol-packing mamas. I met two of these ladies. At the end of the war, servicemen reclaimed their positions and manufacture of ordnance shifted to steel for consumer goods. Now, on your right, we see a woman representing switchboard operators, secretaries, librarians, escorts, and others who were often but not always single and who did not have to leave employment after the war. Miss Helen Holly, Bill's executive secretary for almost 30 years, is one of these women, and she is a fabulous presence in Millie's letters and also letters about Millie. Let's take a look at a cluster of 3 more Millie self-portraits. So, unlike the irresistible perky Alice, I find here what I call an active stillness. An active stillness. It invites our close attention. For each, there is intense heat, yet the figures are calm, fully present in the moment. Heat for the bride is the 2,000 plus degrees inside the blast furnace. The others, okay. Well, the others, now it's working. You want to
This one away.
Okay.
Got this one. There we go.
This is a plot. Okay. The others, okay, so for the bride, it's the internal fire of the blast furnace. Now, for the other 2 figures, it's because these are ingot figures, and the others draw on the blazing intense heat of ingots, which are produced when high temperature molten steel is poured into a mold. And in a strip mill one day, Millie asked the foreman why red-hot ingots were lowered into the soaking pit, and he said, quote, "To give them an even heat and to make them more pliable for reshaping in the rolling mill," end quote. So we see again where the actual immediately struck a chord for imagery about existential, universal issues. And it's tied to Buddhism, where suffering and impermanence are understood to be essential dimensions of human experience. So how to cope with sorrow and tragedy and death? Millie believed that her son's death and other deaths in the family karma awakened in her the long journey toward peace of mind, quote, acceptance of mystery and reverence for life, end quote. To be more pliable, to let go of fear and anger, to forgive. A universal truth she felt and taught. Now, Millie migrated away from steel and self-portraits to images associated with her ongoing commitment to Zen Buddhism, meditation, and the Japanese tea ceremony on her journey toward making peace with the wolf. She did calligraphy, she did mandalas. The Japanese tea ceremony, TC, as Millie called it, is an aesthetic ritual dating back to the 16th century Buddhism that, through its slow pace and attention to the beauty in the everyday, embodies, quote, simplicity, reverence, serenity, courteous and compassionate behavior toward others, end quote. In 1963, she studied at the ancient Urasenki School of Tea in Kyoto. Millie and Bill were instrumental in establishing the New York branch of the Urasenki School in 1968, as well as a Buddhist monastery and retreat in the Catskills. Millie's friends, George Nakashima, Takaizu sculptor Isamu Noguchi, a Benedictine monk, and author Anais Nin were among those on the Urasenki Board of Directors. In the 1964 World's Fair, Millie narrated TC, which was performed by a tea master. And because of her boundless enthusiasm to share this quiet joy of tea, she narrated TC for years in countless schools, including inner city schools, private schools, colleges, grade schools, every place, and also in churches and temples. In 1971, she narrated TC, presented by the tea master Hisashi Yamada at the dedication of the Japanese garden in Bethlehem. She incorporated Christian spirituality into her own ceremony, which she called chalice tea. And she cherished art objects by friends, including a woven Christian form cross by Tawny, a ceramic tea bowl in the shape of a chalice by Takaizu, and a shelf crafted by George Nakashima. Niece Pucci recalls many tea ceremonies in her Jansen apartment, including one for the Dalai Lama. In Buddhist tradition, mandalas are symmetrical, geometric configurations suggesting broadly the universe, and at times the particular, such as on the left, the Greek chapel, which represents a photograph that her son George had taken. So mandalas are intended to invite meditation. And what I think is rather beautiful is Millie also remarked on the meditative and spiritual dimension of stitching these works, touching these works, you can imagine. You see her continued love of color. She also continued stitching other gifts for family and friends, including a needlepoint of Star Wars for her grandson. Did she ever make peace with the wolf? In 1960, Millie had stitched a work called Peaceable Kingdom, inspired by paintings by Quaker preacher Edward Hicks about the desire for peace in turbulent times in Quaker politics. One of the paintings provided the cover art to her 1979 Brother Wolf, which is a tone poem that gently, lyrically tells the story of death and healing. She was 79, and finished the book just after the untimely death of her second son, George, on a photographic assignment in China. He was 58. Hicks's paintings were grounded in the book of Isaiah. The wolf also shall lie down with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion together, and a little child shall lead them. In a beautiful, reflective letter to Joe Cantini, she thanked Joe and Margaret for their decades-long friendship and artistic voyage with her. She acknowledged with grace 3 wolves with which she had made peace. The first, the actual wolf. The second was, and I'm quoting, the wolf-like characteristics related to big business and authority, end quote. And the wolfishness in herself, and I think in all of us. The process of sewing, and I'm quoting, the process of sewing had worked to unite and blend, end quote. I appreciate her self-scrutiny, which I think her meditation certainly moved. And I also appreciate her honesty. Those fearless enthusiasms, Millie wanted others, friends and strangers, to share the joy she knew of Hindu dancing, of needlepoint art, of Nakashima furniture, of the Japanese tea ceremony, and more. Those enthusiasms, Joe Cantini claimed, made him a better self, made him a better, more thoughtful artist. And I am so grateful for Millie's enthusiasms because through her art, her letters, and the very generous individuals that you have heard about and will hear from, they have made this journey of mine a truly joyous one. Thank you very much. We are about to hear by video from Millie's niece, who could not be here today. What I want to indicate is that we also know there is so much experience and expertise here. So when there is, toward the end, a question and answer period, very sincerely, we invite you to share your experience or your knowledge, your expertise, whatever it is, because this needs to be a communal, this needs to be as much as possible a communal experience. So, Margaret Thomas, daughter of Millie Johnstone's brother Eugene Reynold Thomas, and known affectionately forever as Poochie. She is a fine researcher, writer, and editor residing in Harvey Cedars, New Jersey, the Central Jersey Shore area, which she has known intimately all her life. For 35 years, she owned and published The Beachcomber, a weekly seasonal newspaper. She has authored, edited, or co-authored insightful, historically rich books, including Great Storms of the Jersey Shore, Shore Chronicles, Diaries and Travelers' Tales from the Jersey Shore, 1764 to 1955, the prize-winning New Jersey Shipwrecks, 350 years in the Graveyard of the Atlantic, and Island Album, which the New York Times called, quote, an ode to a pioneering way of life long vanished, end quote. She edited, and I loved reading, the fascinating Here's the title, it's a long one. Josephine, a memoir, 1917 to 1959. From Washington working girl to fisherman's wife. And that work captures her mother's adventures, including her time as a single and working woman at the War Department during the Great War, researching and ghostwriting for journalist Lowell Thomas, and marrying Poochie's dad to start a life on the Jersey Shore. That memoir shows that Poochie, her mother, and her aunt had extraordinary interests, minds, and lives.
Everybody, I'm really sorry I can't be there today in person. So I'm going to just tell you a few odds and ends of stories about Aunt Millie and me. We became close in my childhood, I think, because I was born about 6 or 7 years after her son died, and she and Uncle Bill were moving into the Bethlehem house, building the house, and I went there quite a bit. I was sent up there when my brother was born in 1936, and then again 3 years later when my mother had cancer, they sent me up there. And this time I was old enough to write a letter saying, "Can I come home now? I'm having a wonderful time, but I want to come home." And they had a shower up there. We didn't have a shower down here. You had to wash your hair in the kitchen sink. I don't remember too much about her early years there, but I do remember she did some Indian dancing. She had a huge skirt. And I think it might have been in the basement or what could have been formerly a garage. But I remember a group of people there and Aunt Millie in this outrageous outfit. This is before I think she switched to modern dancing and Martha Graham. During the war years, I think Uncle Bill and Aunt Millie might have had some benefit to the rationing because they sent my parents coffee and sugar, and I specifically remember the chocolate that they sent because my mother baked chocolate cakes. And they were very good. And I think if they sent the chocolates, one of those cakes went back up to Bethlehem. In New Hope, at some point, she became involved with Virginia Clark's bookstore. I think Uncle Bill might have funded it, but I'm not sure. Aunt Millie said she still worked there, unquote. But I don't think she was on a salary. But I still have many of the books that she bought me there, the children's books. And I also remember her taking me down into the main part of New Hope and buying me a very pretty dress. I must have been about 10 or 11 years old at the Lance store. I had gone to college in 1950 to Keystone Junior College outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And under Aunt Millie's influence, I transferred to Cedar Crest College for my last 2 years, which I think is pretty nearby where you are now. And I'm not sure exactly when I learned about the horror of her son's death in 1926, when little Tommy was killed by the wolf, when she was married to Oliver Holton and lived in Middletown, New Jersey. There were hints of wolf, but I never really knew anything until I was in college. And in the summer of 1953, I needed a few extra credits to graduate, so I took a summer course at Lehigh. And it was that summer that I heard her sobbing in her bedroom when I went in, and it was the anniversary of Tommy's death. And that's when I learned the whole detailed story. It was a wonderful summer because we got to go to the yacht club, not the yacht club, that's down here where I am, the country club, Saucon Valley Country Club. And I loved the class at Lehigh. I got the only A and I was the only girl. And this summer also, I think was the first time I really paid close attention to her needlepoint for stitching. I remember once sitting in the living room with Margaret Cantini, I think, who was nursing her child. And of course I remember it because 19, I'd never seen anybody nurse a baby. We also went on bike rides together that summer, cut through the country club, and then on a back road around to the house. And I remember thinking, how can such an old lady ride a bike so fast I can barely keep up with her? Well, she wasn't that old as I know now. Around that time, there was a Halloween party at the country club. And she decided to go as an ingot, a steel ingot. So she had this cardboard costume of a colored ingot over her shoulders. And she made quite a hit. Uncle Bill was dressed in Guatemalan clothes that George had brought from Guatemala. Aunt Millie was very colorful. She did not dress like women of her generation, and that was a big influence on me. Before I got married in 1955, she gave me a handmade designer dress that she got me in Paris. In the she went with Bill on some business trips. And I still have it, and it's hanging behind me. Right there. But I don't know if you can see the colors in it. Pinched waist, full skirt. I tried it on again. It's 3 inches too small everywhere. Two print of purple, black, and white. When the time came for my senior prom at Cedar Crest, she suggested I wear her bright green strapless chiffon dress with a purple and green wrap. You can imagine how all I differed from all the girls in their pastel prom dresses. It made me uncomfortable, I don't remember it. And I still have and wear, when it's cold, like last week for St. Patrick's Day, a green fox hat from Bergdorf Goodman. Aunt Millie did not like pretentious labels in her clothes. And I remember what she told me, she took the labels out of the back. And it made no sense to me because no one could see them. This was before many labels were on the outside of the clothing. She reacted to the tradition of long stem roses. She liked to cut them short, so it was a blast of color in the vase. Here are several stories I remember. I wasn't there, she told me, about her interaction with well-known people. In the south of France, Uncle Bill again was on a business trip, she figured out where Picasso took his daily walk. So she planted herself by the grass, on the grass, by the path where he walked. A photo of her shows her wearing a black cotton dirndl skirt with embroidery and rickrack around the bottom. Eventually it came to me, stitching a needlepoint. And sure enough, Picasso stopped, they talked, and she got invited to his house in Antibes. And she had with her at this time, traveling in Europe and in North Africa, a photographer from Paris named Willie Maywald, and he took pictures of everything. So there were pictures, and I think it was in the museum's exhibition of her needlepoint several years ago, her and Picasso and his wife at the time. Once they were on the island of Moustique, and apparently at the same place where Princess Margaret of England was there. And at the outside pool, Aunt Millie told me she got so tired of seeing the ladies-in-waiting all curtsying all the time in their bathing suits, she decided to jump into the pool with all her clothes on. It wasn't true, but that's what she said. Once I saw her tearing a page out of an art book with George O'Keeffe's paintings in it. I said, you shouldn't tear a page out of a book. And she said, oh, Georgia wouldn't mind. And then I heard about her meeting with Georgia O'Keeffe in the Southwest. I don't know exactly when she met Martha Graham, but several years before she died, she and I went to see a performance by Graham's group. And this was, I think, around the late 80s. No, the early 80s. And it was through Martha Graham that Aunt Millie met the famous sculptor Isamu Noguchi, and she took me with her out to his studio in Queens. And I still have a sculpture of his, but a copy, not a real one. When they lived in the UN Plaza, she met lots of famous people there. One of them was Truman Capote. He also lived in the building, and she had him up for a tea ceremony. She said he was, quote, a funny little man. The biggest thrill of all for me was when the Dalai Lama came to her apartment for tea. At the time, I was going to the New School taking a writing and research course, and I stayed overnight every week when I came up into the city. So I happened to be there when the Dalai Lama was giving his first big presentation in Manhattan at Madison Square Garden. But I'm guessing through somebody at the Zendo, they told the Dalai Lama that Mrs. Johnstone wasn't able to attend because her health wasn't good enough, and he came over for tea. And she checked out what I was wearing to make sure it was nothing too colorful before I met him. Just a year or so before Aunt Millie died, we went to see an opera at the Met. Aunt Millie wore this pink cape and her white hair was flowing long, and we walked up the stairs, and a young man came up and asked me, "Who is that woman? Is she somebody?" I said, "Yes, she is my Aunt Millie." I want to give you just a few quotes from letters she has written to me. In 1936, I was 3 years old, and this was addressed to How Is My Cute Thing? We were having a bed built for you in our dressing room, and it would be long enough and wide enough for you when you were a great big girl, about 21 years old. And I do remember sleeping in that bed a lot. But by the time I was 21, I was upstairs into a real bed. In 1957, shortly after my husband died, she wrote the following. And she had introduced me to Bach, and I attended many of the Bach festivals with her. I think Uncle Bill might have sung in the chorus. I don't remember for sure. Quote, "I thought and felt a lot about you during Bach this year, especially this past weekend when I heard it was Dr. Lowe at my side. Who sits next to you made such a difference in the kind of listening and receiving. There was so much tenderness and compassion in the music that the compassion and tenderness, was more alive along with Bach's amazing sense of conviction and faith. Every amen is so full of beginning." And I have been a Bach fan all my life, thank you to Aunt Millie. And I left my second husband in 1970, and I moved out to Marin County in California. About the same time, Aunt Millie was going out there for tea ceremony into a Zendo outside of San Francisco. So she visited me off and on when I stayed there. And this letter wasn't dated, it was probably 72 or 73. Quote, "It's a good feeling to have a daughter, especially when it's you." So that's what I have to say about Aunt Millie today, and I'm sorry I'm not there to answer any questions.
But am I supposed to talk or not?
You're supposed to talk.
I did not prepare a speech like everybody else did, so I'm just going to mention some things from my life. One of the things that's I wanted to say is that Aunt Millie was just so important to my way of being. I met her when I was 2 years old. I was born 6 weeks before all the Japanese Americans on the West Coast were interned. We were released to Bucks County. My father was working at the farm of Antonin Raymond, for whom he had worked as an architect in Tokyo. And so we lived at Raymond Farm, and I think we were still at Raymond Farm where my father was raising chickens when I met Aunt Millie. I was like 2 years old. And my parents had taken me to the bookstore in New Hope. Carol mentioned the bookstore that she had sponsored, and they had just bought me a book, and Millie happened to come in because I think she was responsible for the bookstore. And she looked at me and said, "Would you like a book?" And I said, "No, thank you, I have one." You know. And then she said, "Would you like to come home with me?" And I said, "Okay." And my parents said, "Fine." So I went home with Millie, not even a toothbrush with me, and she put me up in that room that Poochie mentioned that was right next to their bedroom, and I went home and I was so excited. I said, "Mom, Aunt Millie has 2 pumps inside the house, and one of them has hot water." I mean, we were living in the tent. We didn't have any hot water. We didn't even have running water. And so she invited me up to Bethlehem and to other places. I do remember, as Poochie mentioned, the Bach Festival. I remember she took me up to visit William Kincaid, who was the first flutist with the Philadelphia Orchestra. He was performing there, and she took me backstage when I was about 10. And she said, "Oh, Mira plays the flute too." And I thought, oops, I played recorder, but I didn't really play flute. But it made me learn. And then when I was in high school, she took me up to the Trapp Family Singers Camp in Vermont, and that was an experience also. I liked it so much. She arranged that I drove up there in their little 2-seater Thunderbird and stayed at the Trapp Family Camp, singing every single day, all day long. And then she decided to go home, and I said, "Can I stay another couple of weeks?" So she let me stay another couple of weeks, and that was it was a tremendous experience I just would not have had without Millie. And music and singing has been part of my life ever since. When I was in college, I got interested. I didn't really get interested, but probably because of Millie. You had to do physical education first year, to fulfill your requirements for college, and I was doing volleyball, and I fell down off my bicycle and hurt my foot, so I couldn't do volleyball. So I signed up for modern dance because it was mostly floor work, and I figured I didn't need the foot as much as I did as volleyball. So I got into modern dance, and then I ended up at Connecticut College School of Dance in the summer for 2 summers. I'm sure that was Millie. Just having that experience with her. She did teach me, as Poochie too, I think, taught us to do some dance when we were little. And anyway, and then she took me, this was the most important thing that happened in my life with Millie. When I graduated from college in 1963, I guess she had already made friends with Alan Watts, and he was taking a tour of Zen Buddhist temples and culture in Japan, and she took me to Japan on my first trip to Japan. I'd heard about Japan all my life, didn't know Japanese, didn't know anything about Japan particularly except indirectly, so I was really happy to go there in person, and I went with Millie and Alan Watts. And Alan Watts knew all the particulars of all these different kinds of Zen Buddhism and which sects of Buddhism were in which different temples in Kyoto. And we visited them, and it was just the most amazing introduction to Japan and Japanese culture I ever could have had. And then she stayed on to study tea ceremony in Kyoto. And I stayed on in Tokyo with my blood aunt. I mean, Millie was obviously not my blood aunt, but I did have my mother's older sister who lived in Tokyo, so I stayed with her, and I just had to study Japanese all day long, every day, for months and months and months. And then I got into Waseda graduate school in architecture, and it was a struggle. I still don't speak Japanese that well, and certainly don't read and write it, but if it weren't for that introduction to Japan with Millie, probably wouldn't have been able to do what I did. And when I got married, and when I had a baby, she bought, I think she encouraged me. No, I guess it was my Aunt Thelma. My aunts in my life are very important, but my Aunt Thelma, of course, was in Tokyo when I got married, and she supported me and told me I had to get a wedding dress, and she told me, went with me to pick out the fabric and that sort of thing. And then when my baby was born, Aunt Millie sent me a whole trousseau of baby clothes and a christening dress, this beautiful white embroidered christening dress, and a whole bunch of baby clothes. And she was my surrogate mother. My mother didn't even want to know when my baby was born, but she took care of us. And I can't think what else, but that was really significant, going to Japan with Aunt Millie. So, thank you.
Well, I'll ask just a couple of questions because we would like to open it up for every oh, hi. This and I have not gone on well today. Well, thank you. I am very deeply grateful for all that you have done with me and for me in this journey. And I wish I had known her personally, but I do feel very, very close to her because of you, because of those letters. And I feel I'm going to call her Aunt Millie too, if I may. So I know you've mentioned being with her and even seeing her do at her needlework and stitching and so forth. Could you tell us a little bit more about those experiences, Mira?
Well, I did forget to mention that every time I went with Aunt Millie somewhere, or of course, if I visited in Bethlehem, she had a basket full of different colored yarns and this canvas that she was always working on, and she would be stitching and sewing and picking out different colors and trying them and stitching them and ripping them out and then stitching them again and something else and ripping them out again. I just remember that she always did that, and she was always working. It was kind of like a form of meditation for her. It was her way of coping with the Bethlehem Steel environment, and I think she was also, all of her life, she was trying to work through this trauma of having lost her own child when he was so young. And I think that's probably why she adopted both me and Poochie as surrogate children, because she had this empty place in her heart from that time on. And I'm very grateful to little Tommy for creating that space for us.
And that's beautifully articulated, because it seems that this woman had so much love, and it just kind of swept you all up in that love and in her arms, literal and figurative. And yet she also had this other identity that was very anti-authority. So did you see any of that emerge in your experiences with Millie, any of the anti-authority stuff?
That's probably why I'm the way I am. I did, when I went to Harvard, of course, they teach you how to do independent thinking and writing and all this stuff, and I came back and started working for my dad, and Dad was very authoritarian, and my mother was also, and I was adopted. We incorporated shortly after I came back to work at Nakashima's, and I became one of the officers, and I was the outsider. My brother was the other officer, and he lived at home with my parents still, so the three of them would have a meeting without me and then tell me the next day of this thing that they had decided, and sometimes I wouldn't agree with them. I'd let them know. So Dad fired me over and over again. And eventually I went back again, but anyway.
Oh, that's wonderful. So is there anything else you'd like to mention before we open this up to folks?
Oh, no, not at all. I'd like to hear what anyone else has to say or ask or whatever.
Great, okay. And Abby is in charge of the mics and coordinating the logistics and so forth, so...
If you wouldn't mind
by the
raising
way,
your hand if you have a question, and I'll bring the mic to you so everyone can hear your question.
By the way, no, I forgot. I am wearing an Alice Parrot vest, which is made out of Millie colors.
Yes.
I also have a Joseph Cantini pendant around my neck, just for the occasion today.
Yeah,
So
and
I
full
did know them.
full disclosure, because Millie loved bright colors, I'm wearing bright colors, and because she loved the Southwestern Native American jewelry, I have my petty point necklace here and various kinds of Indian jewelry on me. So this is all a tribute to Millie. She has to be with us. She is. She really is.
She used to wear a beautiful squash blossom necklace that I coveted, but I didn't get it.
Actually,
I have squash blossoms today.
Yeah, I have squash blossom here, but it's and the pictures of this, including the squash blossom necklace, because she wore that a lot over the years, many years. I think she must have gotten it like when she was getting her divorce in the Southwest, is when she really, it seems, got into the Southwest frame of mind. So we've all envied the squash blossom, but it didn't wind up with any of us. So, okay.
Question, you mentioned going to Connecticut College for modern dance in some summers, and I was just curious, did you ever get to dance with Aunt Millie doing any modern dance or anything? Because she studied as well, correct?
Yes, but she studied many years before I did. I did get to study with Martha Graham, though, while she was still alive. I was surprised. I mean, she could still do leaps and so forth, and she was 80-something. I mean, her feet were all distorted with arthritis. I think Millie's were too, which is why she was wearing those big, heavy black shoes when she was in New York. But I didn't dance with Millie. Good question.
Other questions? Yes.
I know that your father did sign much of his furniture, but I'm wondering why he didn't sign all of it. I don't know, you have it cataloged, but I just was wondering why he did some and not others.
Have you ever heard of The Unknown Craftsman, written by Soitsu Yanagi? It is the philosophy of Mingei artists, and I don't know if Dad had actually met him or read the book, but he believed that signing artwork is a sign of ego, and ego ruins art. So he refused to sign until the 80s, when a lot of people started imitating him, and then we persuaded him to sign his pieces, but only until the 80s.
I have a question for Carol. Carol, when did you discover Millie, and when did you start, and why did you start to research her?
Well, that's a lovely question. I appreciate that. Actually, it was in 1991. And, well, the story is this. There was an exhibition at the Art Museum on industry and art, and there was a Millie needlepoint there. And what's interesting is, well, my husband and I attended, and I, as usual, sort of wandering around, and my husband, who's much more attentive, came around the corner and went, "Carol, this is something you need to see," because I had been doing for at least a decade scholarly work on needlework in imaginative literature and culture. I mean, I was reading conduct manuals and children's stories, as well as, poems and novels and so forth. And so he went, you need to see this. And I went, oh my God. And so that was the beginning. And then, I connected with the art museum, and I said, I need to know more. But actually, that's true. Even earlier than that, I connected with a Quaker friend, some of you know, Annette Bennert. And she said, oh, I know Margaret Cantini. And so I had several interviews with Margaret Cantini, but also and that actually started in 92, but in 1991 I met, again through the museum contacts, Poochie. And she was just as like, oh, sure, well, let's talk about this. And my husband and I had gone down to the Jersey Shore to visit friends at Long Beach Island, and I stopped in her house, and we talked for hours and hours and hours, and she showed me things. And so that was the beginning. And then, of course, life happens. Now, I did wind up doing a couple of short pieces on Millie, but I, had a full-time plus job at Muhlenberg College, and so I kind of let it go for a while, and then I was asked to do a piece for the 2003 catalog, Poetry in a Steel Mill, which was an entire Millie show at the Allentown Art Museum. And then I sort of got into it again, and then back to work. Well, it was about 5 years ago then I went, I need to get back. I need to do this some more. And so a lot of what I have done has been talking with people. Poochie very generously gave me 250 letters that are from Millie to a correspondent who was in the Midwest. And I've looked at letters from to the Cantinis and the Nakashimas. I've been in various archives, the Tawny archives, and the letters of this Professor Lowe. So all of this has just been truly joyful work. And I think it's all been, and I say, well, if I'd only, and it's like, no, you did it in 1991, and now you've resumed it, and it's whatever time it has to be. We do things then. But I've just found it a truly joyful voyage, in part because of her spirit. And I will say again, those letters are extraordinary because, again, they're playful, they're intellectual without being stuffy. She talks about the art, she talks about the artists, but she also talks about, is that cold better? It's very personal things. So it's so multifaceted. It's an extraordinary world, and I feel so privileged to have been involved in it and to continue. I just want to keep my health. Okay. Thank you for the question.
Also, thank you, Carol, for opening the door to Millie's history again, because I just kind of figured it was in my past. It was okay. And then you've opened those doors again. Some of Millie's letters, there's some in my brother's house, which is my parents' house, that I didn't know about. I think you got to see those too. And I found some in my own house. She would write letters on postcards and painting, reproductions of paintings, and she would write them, like 6 or 7 at a time, and send you a packet of stuff. And then if you read them, you have to make sure that they're back in the same order, or you don't know what she's talking about. And she wrote really big.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're just scrawling across every single postcard, then she'd throw it in an envelope and send it to you. It was great. Yeah. Thank you for making me review those.
Oh. Well, the other thing I will say about those letters is none of her letters had dates.
Yes.
So it'd be Thursday. So a lot of the letters I've been trying to work out through internal evidence. Good luck sometimes. Now, fortunately, the letters that Poochie had that had been sent to her correspondent in the Midwest, to Robert Barbee, he kept the envelopes with postmarks. So that has helped considerably. So to read those letters is just, and then she'll sign it like, love, 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 Aunt Millie, XX.
Hello.